It was the summer of 1945. The war in Europe had ended, the guns had fallen silent, and across the Atlantic, a very different chapter of history was unfolding. In the United States, thousands of German prisoners of war found themselves far from the battlefields of Europe. They had been captured in campaigns stretching from North Africa to France, transported across the ocean, and placed into American camps that bore little resemblance to the grim, wartime propaganda they had once believed. Among them were women, nurses, auxiliaries and camp followers taken into custody as the tide of war turned against Germany. They expected harshness, deprivation, and the sting of vengeance. But what they found was something that would shake their expectations to the core. One of the most extraordinary moments came not on a battlefield, nor behind barbed wire, but inside a place they could scarcely have imagined, an American beauty salon for women who had endured years of fear, hunger, and loss. The mere idea of being pampered with scissors, combs, and fresh perfume was unthinkable. Yet American guards led them into bright rooms, filled with mirrors, hair dryers, and the soft scent of shampoos. What followed was a surreal moment, one where former enemies sat quietly in chairs, their war-worn faces touched by kindness, their hair gently washed and styled, their dignity restored in ways far deeper than surface appearances. This was not just a haircut. It was a message, a reminder that even in war's darkest aftermath, humanity could break through the rubble. And for these women, that day in a beauty salon became a memory more lasting than barbed wire or barracks, a glimpse of heaven in a world they once thought only cruel. When the German women POWs were first told they would be taken outside the camp, suspicion filled the air. Days in captivity had already blurred into routine, roll calls, simple meals, guarded walks around the yard. But this order felt different. It was not the usual march to labor, nor the monotony of another lecture about camp rules. The guards' voices were calm, almost casual, as they announced the transfer, but within the barracks tension crackled. The women exchanged wary glances, whispers in German slipping from one bunk to another. No one trusted sudden changes. In their minds, America was still the enemy, and enemies rarely offered surprises that ended well. Some of the women tried to steady themselves with bravado, muttering that perhaps it was only relocation, maybe even interrogation. Others, quieter and more fearful, believed it was a cruel trick, that they would be mocked, paraded, or shamed. They had been raised on stories that painted Americans as brutal, undisciplined, and eager to humiliate their captives. The idea of being marched out of the gates, away from the familiar barbed wire, stirred both hope and dread. Their hearts pounded with the weight of the unknown. When the trucks pulled up, the sound of engines rumbled like a drumbeat announcing fate. Dust swirled in the summer air as the women were lined up, counted, and ordered aboard. One by one, they climbed into the wooden beds of the military vehicles. The metal sides were hot from the sun, and the soldiers stationed around them watched with a mixture of duty and distance, rifles slung casually but firmly in their grasp. The ride began, and the camp's fences faded into the distance. The world outside the wire was strange. Rolling fields stretched toward the horizon, dotted with barns and farmhouses that looked almost too peaceful. Small towns passed in fragments, children riding bicycles, families strolling with grocery bags, flags fluttering gently in the breeze. To women who had last seen Europe scarred by bombings and ruins, the sight was surreal. America seemed untouched, brimming with life, and this simple drive became its own kind of revelation. Some of the women stared, unable to hide their awe. Others turned their faces away, unwilling to give in to wonder. Yet all of them felt the weight of contradiction pressing down. They were prisoners, but they were also witnesses to a world that appeared whole, prosperous, and safe. The trucks slowed as they entered a quiet main street. Storefronts lined the road, glass windows polished to a shine, mannequins dressed in bright clothes displayed behind them. The air smelled faintly of fresh bread from a bakery nearby, mixed with the sharp sweetness of perfume drifting through an open doorway. It was a world far from rations and scarcity. And then the convoy stopped. Before them stood a building unlike any they expected. A wide glass window revealed rows of cushioned chairs, mirrors lined with glowing bulbs, and women in crisp uniforms arranging brushes and scissors on shining counters. Above the entrance, a neat sign with flowing letters read simply, "Beauty Salon." For a moment, silence fell. The German women POWs stared, their minds racing to grasp what they were seeing. This was no interrogation chamber, no courthouse, no punishment block. It was a place of care, of leisure, of things they had almost forgotten even existed. Nervous laughter broke out among them, thin and brittle. "This must be a mistake," one muttered. Another whispered, "No, they will mock us here." The idea of being marched into a beauty salon by their captors seemed almost absurd, an insult wrapped in comfort. But as the guards gestured for them to move, there was no malice in their tone, no smirk on their lips. They simply guided them forward, as if this were an ordinary errand, as if nothing about it was strange at all. The women shuffled toward the entrance, their boots echoing on the sidewalk. The locals who passed by did not jeer or scorn. They looked on with quiet curiosity, some nodding politely, others barely glancing at all. It was not the spectacle of humiliation they feared. Instead, it felt like stepping into a dream, a scene so far removed from the hardship of war that it almost hurt to believe. The glass door opened, and the women hesitated. Inside, the room glowed with light, reflections bouncing endlessly across tall mirrors. The air carried the soft fragrance of lavender and rose, so different from the staleness of the camp. Cushioned seats awaited them, draped in white cloth. American attendants, women not much older than themselves, offered gentle smiles, holding combs and brushes with hands that did not shake with fear or hunger. At that moment, confusion reached its peak. Why here? Why now? What purpose could possibly be served by bringing enemy prisoners into such a place? And yet, beneath the uncertainty, something stirred, something they had not allowed themselves to feel in years. It was the faintest flicker of curiosity. As they were ushered inside, one of the women caught sight of her reflection in the mirror near the door. For an instant she froze. Her face was thinner than she remembered, her hair tangled and dull, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She realized she could not remember the last time she had seen herself clearly, not just as a soldier, not as a prisoner, but as a woman. And for the first time, she wondered if this place might not be a punishment at all, but something else entirely. Still, suspicion lingered like a shadow. Even as they stepped further into the salon, their bodies stiff, their voices hushed, the thought gnawed at them. What do the Americans want? Were they trying to break them with kindness? Was this some elaborate show for propaganda? Or was it something even stranger, a gift with no catch? The guards stood back, their presence steady but not intrusive. They did not bark orders, did not push or prod. They simply waited as the women took their places, allowing the attendants to guide them with soft voices and practiced ease. And in that subtle difference, the absence of force, the presence of choice, the first cracks appeared in their walls of mistrust. The war had taught them to expect cruelty, to live by suspicion, to guard their dignity with clenched fists. Yet here they were, sitting in padded chairs under warm lights, offered brushes and water instead of commands and barbed wire. It was a dissonance almost too large to process. But as the minutes passed, the strangeness began to soften, replaced by a quiet awareness that perhaps, just perhaps, the world was wider than what they had been taught to believe. That single walk from the camp gates to the salon door was more than a change of scenery. It was a crossing between two realities, the one they had left behind, filled with harshness and fear, and the one that now stood before them, shimmering with the possibility of something they could scarcely name. Inside, the atmosphere was surreal. The moment the German women stepped through the door, the world shifted around them. The heavy scent of dust and sweat that clung to their clothes was overtaken by something soft, clean, and almost intoxicating. Floral soaps, polished wood, the faint sharpness of hair tonic. For a moment they simply stood still, as if their minds refused to accept what their eyes saw. Rows of tall mirrors reflected their gaunt figures back at them, duplicating their uncertainty 100 times over. Bright bulbs framed the mirrors, casting a warm glow that softened the hollows in their cheeks, and the deep lines of fatigue etched by war. It felt like stepping into a place outside of time, as though the very air insisted they shed their fears at the door. The attendants moved toward them, not with hostility, but with a practiced grace born of routine. They were young American women, dressed in pressed uniforms of pale cotton, their hair pinned neatly, their faces open and calm. In their hands were brushes, scissors, and towels, ordinary tools that suddenly carried extraordinary weight. For the German women, these were not just objects. They were symbols of a life they had lost long ago. To see them now in the hands of strangers who did not wield them as weapons but as instruments of care felt almost incomprehensible. The guards gave a nod, stepping back as if to make space for what was about to unfold. One by one, the prisoners were guided toward the cushioned chairs. Some resisted at first, stiffening as though they might be struck, but the attendant's touch was gentle, coaxing rather than commanding. The first trickle of warm water spilled over one woman's scalp, and she closed her eyes instinctively, the sensation so foreign it startled her. She tried to remember the last time she had felt clean water that wasn't rationed or cold. The last time fingers had moved through her hair, not in haste, but with care. As more women took their places, the room filled with the sound of running water, the faint hum of hairdryers, the steady snip of scissors. It was music unlike any they had heard in years. There were no explosions here, no shrill whistles of falling bombs, no barked orders echoing through concrete halls. Only the quiet rhythm of ordinary life, carried out in a salon that seemed untouched by war. Some of the women began to relax, their shoulders loosening, their hands unclenching from their laps. It was as if the war was being washed from their hair strand by strand, combed out with every stroke. The mirrors soon revealed transformations, subtle but undeniable. Hair once tangled and dulled by neglect began to shine under the salon lights. Faces appeared softer, no longer just prisoners, but women rediscovering the simple dignity of being seen. A few dared to smile at their reflections, small at first, like flickers of light struggling against years of shadow. Their laughter, hesitant, fragile, broke out in sudden bursts, echoing strangely against the polished glass. It was laughter not born of amusement but of disbelief, of the realization that even after everything, they could still look into a mirror and recognize themselves. One prisoner, her hair freshly brushed into a neat wave, stared into the glass with tears welling in her eyes. She remembered how, before the war, she had sat in a small salon in Hamburg, chattering with friends as her hair was styled, planning dances and celebrations that never came. Those memories felt like they belonged to another person, another life. Yet here, across an ocean and in the hands of those who had been her enemies, the memory returned, not as a cruel reminder of loss, but as a tender glimpse of what might still exist. The attendants, though they spoke little German, did not need words to bridge the gap. Their actions spoke with clarity. A towel wrapped around the shoulders, a comb untangling knots, a steady hand shaping nails. It was a language older than war, one of human care. The POW women, accustomed to suspicion and guardedness, began to respond in kind. Some whispered "Danke" under their breath. Others nodded silently, unable to express in full what their hearts felt. The barriers between captor and captive seemed to thin, replaced by something neither side could quite name. As the treatments continued, a strange unity filled the room. The POWs, once stripped of identity and reduced to numbers, began to feel their individuality again. Each woman's reflection in the mirror told a story of hunger endured, of fear survived, of resilience tested, but also of a new chapter written in real time. They were not free, not yet, but for this fleeting moment they were not prisoners either. They were simply women being cared for, human beings allowed to reclaim a small piece of themselves. The war seemed far away, muffled by the hum of hairdryers and the whisper of scissors slicing through strands of hair. Outside, life in the American town carried on. Cars passed, children played, shopkeepers greeted customers. But inside the salon, another kind of battle was quietly being won. Not a battle of armies, but a battle against despair. And as each woman left her chair, her hair newly styled, her hands freshly manicured, she carried with her the proof that even in the ruins of war, kindness could still exist. What lingered most was not the physical change, though it was striking. It was the feeling, the sensation of being touched without cruelty, of being looked at without judgment, of being treated without suspicion. For many, that simple gift was worth more than all the food, all the comforts, even all the promises of eventual repatriation. Because it reminded them that beneath the uniforms, beyond the flags, there was still something unbroken: humanity. For the American guards and townspeople, this act was deliberate. It was never meant as mere indulgence or distraction. To them, it was a demonstration of something deeper, something rooted in values they believed defined their nation. They had fought a war against tyranny, against brutality, against a system that had reduced human life to numbers and obedience. Now, with the war concluded, their victory had to be expressed not only in weapons and treaties, but in showing what stood on the other side of that darkness. And so, in a small-town beauty salon, the message was written not in speeches or banners, but in brushes, scissors, and warm water. The guards understood. She allowed herself to imagine a life after captivity, a life where she could be more than a prisoner or a cog in a machine. For yet another, it was the first time she saw the possibility that her captors were not monsters, but people. For the Americans, the meaning was clear. This was not weakness. It was strength of a different kind, one they hoped would leave an imprint that no barbed wire fence could erase. They wanted the prisoners to carry home a memory not of harshness, but of humanity. They wanted them to remember that even in defeat, they were treated as human beings. It was an idea powerful enough to reshape bitterness into reflection, to plant seeds that might one day grow into reconciliation. And for the German women themselves, the visit became a memory etched in permanence. Long after the war, when the camp gates had opened and they returned to their homelands, they would recall that day in vivid detail. They would tell their families, their children, perhaps even their grandchildren, of the strangeness of it all, the absurdity of being marched into a beauty salon by guards, the shock of seeing their hair styled by those they had once called the enemy, and the quiet dignity they felt walking back into the camp with their heads held higher. More than just a change in hairstyle, it symbolized a change in perception. War had taught them that brutality was normal, that the enemy was always cruel, that kindness had no place in survival. But that afternoon shattered the lie. It proved that compassion could cut through even the thickest walls of suspicion. It proved that sometimes the sharpest weapon was not steel or fire, but humanity itself. And so, as the sun dipped lower in the sky and the salon's lights glowed warmly in the mirrors, a quiet truth settled into the hearts of all who were there. Enemies could be cared for. Prisoners could be treated with dignity, with the power of symbols. They knew that a clean bed in a barracks could shatter the myths of American cruelty, just as a hot meal could soften the bitterness of captivity. But the salon was different. It was intimate, personal. It touched not the stomach or the body alone, but the spirit. Watching their former enemies, these women who had once been part of a vast machine of war lean back into cushioned chairs and close their eyes as their hair was washed. It revealed something profound. It showed that America's strength was not only in its armies, but in its humanity. The townspeople who saw the women escorted to and from the salon carried mixed emotions. Some looked on with curiosity, others with quiet approval, and a few with unease. To offer such kindness to prisoners was controversial to some. Yet for others, it was a matter of pride. They believed that compassion, even for an enemy, was what set them apart from the very ideologies they had fought to defeat. For those who understood, this moment was a deliberate act of redefinition. These women were not being rewarded. They were being reminded, and perhaps teaching themselves, that war need not strip away decency forever. Inside the salon, the POW women sensed this too. At first, they could not accept it. Years of conditioning had taught them that weakness was dangerous, that kindness always carried a hidden cost. Yet as they looked into the mirrors afterward, their hair shining, their posture straighter, they began to see more than just a new image. They began to see themselves as part of a story they had never expected to be written. Here, in this foreign land, their enemy was showing them not vengeance, but a strange kind of mercy. It unsettled them, and yet it comforted them too. Some carried the experience silently, storing it deep inside, unwilling to speak of it even to each other. Others whispered in hushed tones, admitting they had felt a weight lift from their hearts in that salon chair. For one, it was the first time she remembered being touched gently since before the war began. For another, it was the first time, and women who had once been defined by a uniform, by propaganda, by the scars of war, could walk away with something far more powerful than styled hair. They could walk away with the knowledge that kindness was still possible. Even in the ashes of a world nearly destroyed, the memory endured, not because it was extraordinary in spectacle, but because it was extraordinary in its simplicity. A comb, a brush, a smile, a reflection in the glass, these became the symbols of a victory greater than any battlefield could hold. For the POWs, it was a glimpse of heaven in a place where they had expected only cruelty. For the Americans, it was proof that even in victory, the truest strength lay in compassion.